we're going to start the day off with a really strategic discussion of thinking of business as something more than business with Ambassador Lee Wolosky, who has joined us for the keynote today. And I am so pleased to be able to introduce him to you. Ambassador Lee Wolosky was promoted by President Obama to the personal rank of ambassador in 2016 after years and years of service to the United States. He has served under President Bill Clinton and President George W. Bush as Director of Transnational Threats on the National Security Council at the White House. He has served President Obama as the Special Envoy for the Guantanamo closure from July 2015 to January 2017. He has recently returned from a stint at the White House as Special Counsel to President Biden. He has one of the most complete views of how business and national security intersect due to his long and distinguished government service, as well as a service as a partner at Jenner & Block, where he is the co-chair of Jenner & Block's litigation department and a member of the firm's management committee. He has extensive experience in representing clients in multidimensional crises involving litigation, governments, and the media, and has represented CEOs, governments, leaders, organizations, and therefore is really one of the people who could put all of this together for us as to how to make sense of where we are in this moment in time and what the geostrategic importance of business is at this moment in time. So, Ambassador, I'm really looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Professor. And it's a great pleasure to be here today. I was experiencing some connectivity problems, so if I become hard to hear or see, please let me know and I'll work to fix those. And I don't know if I am a skeptic or an optimist or a pessimist on the issue. I think I'm more confused than anything else, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I certainly always used to think that business and trade and globalization were about peace building, and that business played a critical role in that. But now I'm not so sure. And I'm saying that because I think we're at a critical juncture in assessing all of these issues, trade, business, and what has been called globalization. And if you hearken back to the more simple times, the 1990s, the end of the Cold War, the integration of China into the world economy, starting with its accession to the WTO in 2001, those were the glory days of economic liberalization and globalization. And that mantra survived for decades, certainly throughout most of my working life, and only began to be questioned in recent years through the aggressive conduct of countries like Russia and China, which were in many ways the most important objects of these movements or ideas. Then, of course, the mantra exploded with the election of Donald Trump to the presidency in 2016, which took certainly our political elites and our economic elites by complete surprise, even if many of the underlying currents had been brewing in the country for years before. But let me start for a few moments with a discussion of Russia, which for 30 years I certainly thought was sort of at the forefront of peace building through economic integration. And this is sort of a 30-year experiment, which I played a personal role, and I'll explain in a moment. But what I think is significant is that it all came crashing down in less than 4 weeks, starting in February of this year. And that really was the result of the stark and largely unpredicted reaction of Western business to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which reversed in a matter of days, really a decades-long project in economic integration. And as I alluded to, I actually had a sort of front row seat to that, because my first job out of college in the early 1990s was to work for a Harvard University project that was a group of professors who were working to advise ultimately President Gorbachev on economic and political reform in what was then the Soviet Union, opening up the economy and privatizing the industrial base of Russia. And then as a young lawyer, a few years later, I represented Western investors in newly privatized Russian companies. And although there certainly were a lot of complications during that period, particularly in the area of corporate governance, as anyone who lined up outside of the McDonald's in Moscow could tell you, it was an era of great promise as economic walls collapsed with political walls. And during this time period, up until just recent years, we really saw Western businesses move into Russia, and we saw Russia's economy and financial system become integrated with international trade infrastructure in the global economy. And that was largely perceived to be a success. And it was understood to lead to, or at least the hope was that it would lead to moderation in Russian behavior. Of course, that didn't prove to be the case, starting with Russian incursion in Georgia in 2008, and then in Crimea in 2014. And what was really been stark, though, in my mind, and I was at the White House for part of the run-up to the U.S. response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was the response of the business community here in the United States. These were, what we've seen were voluntary actions that went large beyond what was required by sanctions, and basically a desertion of all businesses and service companies like law firms of Russia, even where that was not required by law. Now, of course, that was a result of the egregious behavior that we saw in Russia, that the world saw in Russia, particularly at the beginning of the Russian invasion. But it was frankly not contemplated by the US government. The sanctions regime was very carefully designed, but the voluntary exodus of US businesses was neither orchestrated by the United States government nor fully contemplated by it. I think that regardless of the success of the sanctions regime, which some people are now calling into question, given the strength of the ruble and the apparent resiliency of the Russian economy, the voluntary exodus of Western businesses and service companies is, in my view, likely to be enduring, at least while Putin remains in power. And so, we are sort of at a critical juncture. We don't know how it's going to turn out, but I think the really remarkable thing about it, in my view, is how this 30-year experiment, which I was personally invested in at various points in my career, came crashing down in a matter of weeks. And I think it reflects the power of business to make independent choices that impact US foreign policy. And it serves to illustrate how business community has served as sort of autonomous actors impacting foreign policy independent of the directives of government. Now, switching briefly to China, we've seen a similar phenomenon in recent years in China, not as fast, of course, not as dramatic, but slowly over the years, and then I would say accelerating during the COVID pandemic. We've seen growing disquiet in the 20 years following Chinese accession to the WTO, and now I think we see multiple phenomena at play simultaneously. Well, what's happening now, of course, has been happening against the backstop or the backdrop of longstanding wholesale intellectual property theft in China and the imposition of trade barriers by the Chinese government in violation of its free trade obligations as a member of the WTO. But more impactful and more recent, of course, has been the supply chain disruptions occasioned by the COVID pandemic, dramatically impacting US businesses and obviously US consumers as well. And I think also we've begun to understand that there's a significant national security component to the extent to which our supply chain has grown reliant on Chinese manufacturing. And I'm not just talking about things like rare earth mineral dependency and other components of our tech industry, but I'm talking about what we all experienced in 2020. We can't find masks. We can't find personal protective equipment in the United States. A remarkable fact given the technological superiority and the manufacturing industrial base of the United States. We couldn't get it. And I think it served to open up a lot of eyes to some of the significant downsides to our reliance on Chinese supply. And more recently, we've seen the Chinese policy of zero tolerance toward COVID lock down major cities like Shanghai and major manufacturing hubs. And that's all just been in the past few weeks, where I think, again, the American business community has really begun to accelerate what had been an earlier movement, slow movement, to move manufacturing out of China. You're now seeing more companies leaving or looking to leave for other low-wage manufacturing bases in the region. And then there are other national security components too that the business community is facing in China. The Uyghur forced labor issue obviously has been significant, but now it's embodied in US law, where the sort of the burden of proof has shifted to the business community to prove that forced labor is not used in the composition of exports to the United States. And US businesses have also faced significant concerns with respect to removing content at the direction of Chinese authorities and maintaining data, being forced to maintain data, even of non-Chinese users of IT products in China, so that the Chinese have jurisdiction and control over that data. So these are broadly the issues at play. And when I say I'm confused, this is why. I mean, it's not a simple scenario of businesses bringing peace and prosperity and rule of law to China, or certainly to Russia. And I think that that's why you see sort of the schizophrenia in Washington right now with respect to our China policy in the Biden administration, whether to repeal the Trump tariffs or not, whether to seek to cooperate with China in certain limited areas, or just engage in full-on competition and containment. And I think we are trending toward more full-on competition and containment, sort of again reversing, in this case, a 20-year trend that had favored liberalization and trade. We're seeing new defense alliances like the Quad and the AUKUS pop up, and even at this weekend's G7, as Freddie alluded to, there was a new public-private infrastructure initiative announced that is intended to compete with the Chinese Belt and Road initiative. So finally, just a few concluding remarks, and because I know we want to get to some moderated discussion. I think what we really are seeing is the whole construct of free trade, globalization, has largely blown up, frankly, in the past few years. And the last thing I'll touch on is just the domestic political components of that, because globalization really had been the mantra of both the Democratic and the Republican Party until recent years. And that, of course, has blown up since Donald Trump's election, and globalization and trade have suddenly become, not suddenly, but they've become sort of dirty words and suspect to a large portion of the electorate. And I would say that we have seen the undercurrents of that, for instance, criticism of NAFTA, other things that frankly should have given warning to what I'll call the political elites in Washington, but they were largely missed. And it was really only in 2016 when the business and political elites woke up to the dissatisfaction of people who traditionally voted Democratic, but instead became Donald Trump supporters for a number of reasons. But trade was significantly one of them, along with an attendant cultural critique where voters began to blame the so-called global elites, creating new fault lines, frankly, around trade that are as deep as racial or regional or other fault lines that exist in American society. So this is still all playing out. I think free trade is still here. The political messaging around it has changed. We saw, for instance, Free Trade Association stood up in Asia to counter China last month. And I think we're still going to see impetus in regional bodies for purposes of containing countries like China, and even in the Western European context now, with respect to the response to Ukraine. But it's not driven by, I think the support for free trade that exists now isn't driven by promises of greater efficiencies or economic growth. It's frankly driven by more strategic imperatives, like containing a geostrategic adversary. So all of which is to say, I remain confused. It's a confusing environment, but I welcome our discussion, Freddie.
Thank you so much. So when I was thinking about, as one of the organizing topics for our conversation, was to look at two different models, one that apparently failed, and we might be at a point where we need to seriously reassess it, and that would be to look at the German integration of Russian exports into the German and European energy economy that now seems to be a significant problem as we're looking through the sanctions options that we have available to us. And then on the other hand, to look at the containment approach and the Trans-Pacific Partnership and how that was modeled differently. Let me start off by sort of asking, do you see the United States potentially in a similar position vis-a-vis China as the European Union was vis-a-vis Russia due to the supply chains that we've built, or do you think that these are very different animals?
Yeah, it's in many ways a critical question, and I don't think that the dependency is as severe, in part because mostly you're talking about consumer goods and things of that sort as opposed to energy. But I'll tell you, I would say, just because you raised Germany, I think that I said earlier that the voluntary response of U.S. business to the conflict in Ukraine was an unexpected thing to the U.S. government, to the Biden administration. So too was the response of Germany in many ways. I mean, it was really a remarkable thing to watch 70, 80 years of German foreign policy reverse itself in 3 weeks. The Germans have now committed $100 billion to their defense. But most significantly, actually, as a business point, the German business community was very embedded with Russia, both in energy and just in manufacturing writ large. And in many ways, that reversal has been even more stark just because it was deeper than the U.S. business community's integration with Russia ever was. But I think you're seeing both in the EU Russia context and in the US-China context, you're seeing a decoupling. It's happening more slowly in the US-China context, but I think it's happening. And I think it's frankly a good thing that it's happening from a policy perspective, and I know that that runs counter to some of the mantra of, business and peace building. But, I have my doubts about that in the Chinese context. And, I think that the lessons of COVID showed us that we were too dependent on Chinese supply chain. And I think that's going to be playing out over the next decade or so with, it's going to be interesting to see whether it leads to a revitalization of the American manufacturing base, or whether it just means, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines. But I think it's the interesting thing is that we're living in interesting times, dynamic times, and it's happening now. Again, not as slowly as what we're seeing in Europe with Russia, but it's happening real time.
So let me pick up on 2 points there. One, which I think is really fascinating, is as you're looking at these supply chains, I think that there is certainly a difference between Taiwan to the US and Ukraine to the European Union, given the chip manufacturing powerhouse that Taiwan has become. So there seems to be there a further problem that would add itself to the problems that we see in Ukraine, and that at least there, if you speak as, spoken as a realist for a moment, there wasn't any direct supply chain problem in the same way as there would be to the extent that the US would be denied access to that chip manufacturing there would be in Taiwan. So that would create one issue that would certainly counsel, and that would counsel against then saying, well, let's keep supply chains out in Asia, where they are within the military sphere of influence, or sphere of potential aggression by a competitor. At the same time, Taiwan is, I think, very much firmly a different animal than Ukraine, precisely because it is so deeply woven into our supply chain. So how do you see that risk-benefit analysis playing out as to, well, do we integrate more and therefore have more forward risk, but also more forward stability? Or do we do the opposite and retrench and give ground?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of scary in a certain sense if you drill down on the dependency on computer chips, traced to, or sourced to Taiwan. And you may know the statistics better than I do, but it's I know enough to know that it's frightening, and that we are significantly dependent on Taiwanese manufacturing for computer chips that fuel not just our computers, but everything that needs a chip. So. And we learned during the pandemic that that's a lot of stuff. And, there's domestic legislation that's intended to correct that. But again, you're talking about things that are going to take years to play out. And I think it's a frightening situation to realize, that our industrial economy is so vulnerable to the threat of aggression. And, I think that also during the past 20 or 30 years, during the era of globalization, many of us were deluded into thinking that wars of aggression were things of the past. And of course, we would never see the Chinese, invade Taiwan or Russia invade anyone. But in fact, we're now learning that our present time is no different than any other period in history. And in fact, wars do happen. And we need to be prepared economically in terms of our business architecture for the possibility that we may not have supply that, that was set up through globalization. I mean, the whole construct of globalization is built on efficiency. And it's not built on, sort of the real world threat of aggression. And I think we're now confronting some of the consequences of that in Taiwan. And, fortunately, we haven't, we're not yet at the point of testing, the thesis of what's going to happen if our supply or access to chips that are Taiwanese manufactured is threatened, but it is a very significant issue.
In terms of the alliances, you mentioned, countering the Belt and Road Initiative. I kind of keep thinking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership in that way. It seems to me that if we want to have allies, we need to integrate those allies through business partnerships, and that business would have a stabilizing role there. Has thinking changed on that, or is really the Trans-Pacific Partnership still the gold standard, be it one that got toppled for political reasons in 2016?
Yeah, I mean, it got toppled, but something else was stood up in Tokyo last month. And frankly, I have not studied, what was stood up. Obviously, it was intended to counter China. And obviously, it is in addition to, in my mind, what are, sort of more stark manifestations of the current administration's policy toward China, which are, more military and diplomatic, namely the Quad and the AUKUS arrangement with Australia and the United Kingdom, the sale of advanced military technology to Australia, and other military steps to try to contain and Chinese power, particularly in the Pacific. So, I don't know. I don't know what the story has, unfolding with respect to business. Obviously, taking the TPP offline was a significant step, in the wrong direction with respect to containing Chinese economic power. Because I think what I was trying to articulate around sort of the change in how I see free trade, or at least the political messaging around it, is that I don't think in the current space it's about efficiency or even low prices for American consumers. I think it's about containing the power of our adversaries, and I think that is more likely to lead to a successful model for the entry of free trade agreements in the current political environment in the United States. And I think that's what happened in Tokyo.
To pivot to a slightly different topic, but I think one where the partnership between business and government is absolutely strategically vital, is cyberspace, both in terms of cyber communication, Twitter, Instagram, all the social media platforms, as well as in the development of AI and regulation of AI in collaboration with business. How do you see the partnership between business and Western governments, shall we say, play out there? What are things that we're doing right, and where do we need to do more?
Yeah. Well, we are understandably skeptical of AI in the United States. I again, drawing from personal experience, I represent the largest U.S. facial recognition company, which isn't very large, but it's the most significant one, called Clearview AI, and its major competitor is the state of China. It's not, these are like 20 guys versus the state of China. And the relationship with our government is complicated because, there are understandable privacy concerns that we have to contend with. And I don't know if anyone read this piece in the New York Times over the weekend about the Chinese surveillance state and use of AI. But we are in a situation where, the Chinese, devote billions of dollars to supporting new technologies, AI. And at least in AI, it's much more complicated over here in the United States. And my client is at risk of being shut down because of lawsuits from privacy advocates. Again, there are privacy issues associated with the use of facial recognition. In my view, the appropriate responses, regulation. I mean, this is one of these very interesting areas where technology has far outpaced the legal regime, and we just do not have laws in place that govern certain emerging technologies that are frankly critical to our competitiveness and to our national security system as well. And so when you have that legal vagueness, you have a lot of litigation, and sometimes it just drags some of these emerging technology companies down. So, again, I feel like I am the Debbie Downer of the conference, but I'm trying to point out at least sort of the fault points.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, the reason that I thought about this, there's this book, Blitzkrieg, The New Challenge of Cyber Warfare by John Archaea, which is a fantastic book to open one's eyes to the strategic military implications of the AI race, and that we may not be winning it at the moment against the Chinese. And so, to sort of see, well, however one views Facebook, however one views Twitter and their data gathering approaches, we seem to need something of that sort in order to keep up.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of part of my point, which is, I'm not sure, in some areas we are winning or competitive, in some areas we're not winning. And whereas the Chinese have, industrial policy and state policy to support the growth of those industries, in some cases, not only do we not have that, but we have private litigation that sort of drags these companies down. And that is certainly something that is going to impact our competitiveness. On the cyber, again, this is far beyond my expertise, but I do think that I am keep your fingers crossed, but I am impressed that the Russians have not yet caused more damage either to Ukraine or to the United States as a result of that conflict. I don't know why that's the case, but I'm observing it as others have, that we have not seen the cyber destruction that you might expect in the current environment, where not only are the Russians at war, but they're sort of losing, or at least they're not winning. And when they're not winning and their back is up against the wall, you would think that they would escalate in any sphere that they could. And who knows what's going on in the battles of cyberspace, but fortunately, we're not really seeing any negative repercussions of any significance.
There were two events that had me kind of raise my head a little. One was that I think Microsoft caught a attack before it happened and cooperated with the United States Department of Defense very early on and actually thwarted the attack. So that would be one of those really key business to government cooperations that were helpful in thwarting a Russian advance. The other one, and I'm probably just giving my tinfoil hat, but there was an LNG plant that had a fire very, very recently, and the first thought I had, oh wow, because that was just a little too convenient, just a little too inconvenient of a time. So my first went to, was this a cyber attack? And we'll need to see what on earth happened when they do the investigation and all of that. But as you say, so far we haven't had a lot of those.
Right. Right.
And so hopefully that means that the collaborations that we've built up between what TSA and energy companies and cyber companies on cybersecurity have reasonably held. One more question on this, and then I wanted to open it up to the room. And if nobody in the room has a question, I'll have one more. And that is the information environment that we're in at the moment. So one of the biggest threats that the intelligence community has assessed and has assessed for a while is that we're prone to be victims of misinformation on Twitter, on Facebook, and social media platforms. How do you see that as a threat matrix? And do you think that we need stronger regulations to counter it? Or do you think that self-regulation by the business world can do it?
Yeah, these are really tough constitutional and sort of business issues to wade through. And I can't confess to having spent a significant amount of time sort of thinking through, the role of private business in policing disinformation. I think it's a crisis, obviously, that sort of objective truth is sort of a lost concept. I'm sure many of us have, older children who, sort of treat what they read in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times with the same degree of believability as whatever they find on Facebook. It's sort of mortifying. And business certainly has a role. I'm a little bit struck though by how, even though Facebook has, so many content modulators, we still have, significant issues with content. So I just don't know. I mean, that sort of suggests to me that maybe that isn't the solution to the problem. But I would be sort of stepping way outside my area of competency, but professing to know what is the solution to the problem. Obviously, though, we face a significant problem at the convergence of technology and disinformation.
So, well, let me ask you one last question then, and then bring us to a close. And the question is climate change and the need for global cooperation around energy infrastructures on climate change, where you have business working with governments, where you've got to cooperate with China, where you got to cooperate with India, where you got to cooperate with Russia. How do you see the challenges there for the next 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, they're very great. And I think that a lot of that cooperation that's necessary isn't happening right now. And I also think that, a broader setback to our common environmental agenda is inflation and the war in Ukraine and supply shock in global oil markets. And, that's going to set back this president's climate agenda for sure. You have President Biden about to go to Saudi Arabia. It would have been unimaginable, even 6 months ago. And so, we are facing a significant setback because of the state of the economy, and also, the state of our bilateral relationships with key countries that we have to cooperate with in order to solve the climate crisis. Again, sorry to be the Debbie Downer at the garden party.
It's good to know what the challenges are, and that the ask is high. Well, thank you so very much for making the time. It has been an amazing tour to see where we are, what the problem is, how things over the last few months have really thrown everything that we took for granted into a state of heightened confusion, and to see that, well, business has something to do with it and has done more than we expected, but that has also created more problems than we expected. So thank you so very much.